Hi, this is another video. Here's an event from last month since I've been boycotting the CTQ bot. I spent all my time on the game recently playing wars to get warmed up for this season now that Triton has been miraculously revived. This isn't your conventional go next season scenario though, because as I specified at the end of my previous commentary, CTs have moved to an entirely new server and league. Over the course of the commentaries that I've made each CTL season, which I didn't even necessarily intend on doing, I ended up inadvertently detailing some of the markers of the league's decline. I gradually bore witness to a league that, over the past 5 or so seasons, managed to lose touch with its player base and lose the respect of the community as a result, some of which is the fault of the council's leadership, but an equal amount of which is the result of a cumulative aggregation of grievances and unfortunate circumstances that are seemingly a part of a wider MKW community cycle. My efforts to try to document the beginning of CTC will be more of an abridged segment than the one I'll recount here about the decline of CTL, because understanding why CTL no longer exists has a great deal to do with CTC's express goals and will help to create a mentally modeled barometer by which its success can be measured in the future. And just as I have in previous videos, I'll go back in time a few years to where I personally recall the first hints of the issues that would come to plague CTL right around its late to middle stages. Around seasons 8 and 9, I started to get the impression that CTL was becoming increasingly samey and that collective motivation was decreasing. In my mind, I didn't indict the staff for this because I believed it had to do with the player base and the recurring set of teams that would play in D2 each season. Omega, IF, PL, and plenty of others I'm neglecting to mention that also made appearances. But upon further inspection, the notion of blaming a rigid player base is also inaccurate because the CT teams of the past had played against similar LVUs and teams for up to years at a time without feeling burned out, leading me to believe that this perceived homogeneity was all in my head apart from the collapse of Season 8's D1, keep this in mind. As for what was going on in any div below 2, I had no idea and still hardly keep track to this day, but with how enjoyable I was able to find my time in D2 in seasons 9 and 10 despite a notable lack of variety in comparison to previous seasons, that feeling temporarily dissipated. But what I paid less attention to was the concerning loss of D1 engagement. Season 9 saw main season free wins left and right continuing on Season 8's downturn, and Season 10's D1 playoffs were outright depressing for anyone who watched them live like I did, because they proved something worrisome. There didn't exist a team that could stand up to the now dominant 6C, the first appearance of which was in Season 7, without any playoff finals losses in 4 seasons apart from PRS's free win in Season 8. But it was during and after Season 10 that the player base began to develop a real fear of playing 6C, and in the plainest terms I can't find that unreasonable at all. A strategy that Zach first tried to employ, starting in Season 10 in particular, was to get as much information from Council ahead of time so as to ensure that we in Triton would be D2, and that if we were slated to be in D1 that we could make roster adjustments in order to appease them. I've been ambivalent over whether playing in D1 should be our goal, especially given that we were seeded first in D2 for a few seasons straight, but the discouraging creep towards inactivity that I originally believed to be unrelated to the skill gap made me much more sympathetic to Zach's efforts to duck D1. A cursory look through the D1 results from the Season 8 to 14 range will demonstrate the lack of motivation through all the free wins I made mention of. But in just the same way I didn't pay any mind to D1's inactivity for a while, I also didn't ascribe any particular significance to the fluctuating motivation. I blamed 6C in my mind, but was hesitant to want to try to draw that line of thought out any further. It's only after so many seasons of gratuitous reps chat drama and being privy to countless statements that we in D2 were the ones playing the real competitive division that I've started to mentally broaden the supposed negative impact of 6C's continued existence. In episode 5, during my CTL Season 12 retrospective, I did a segment in support of 6C about how I thought they were being unfairly maligned by people who weren't willing to adopt the correct competitive spirit. My thought process then was that what the league needed most were more teams like PL and Omega, teams who weren't afraid of playing in D1, while others like Triton and MI sought to preserve the sanctity of the competitiveness of D2 instead by challenging up. That phrasing is how I cope with being a serial ducker myself by virtue of the fact I listen to Zach. My confidence in the possibility of more teams with the right mentality cropping up continued to decrease as time went on, though, especially in the wake of PRS's retirement after yet another playoff loss in Season 11, leaving 6C even less contested than before. Now that I can view CTL in a retrospective light, I realize it's time to be candid about the impact that 6C had, because my neutral perspective on them is evidently not shared by anyone else. They were an extremely demotivating factor and, dare I say, the primary reason, at least if you weren't to overthink it and you were to have looked plainly at the contemporary state of the league, I'll get back to this later, that D1 felt stuck. But it was as a result of both this as well as the Goldilocks zone that D2 fortuitously happened to find itself in for a few seasons that Council, even if they did want to force any teams up, didn't end up doing so. Season 10 in particular perfectly exemplified all of this by virtue of just how many good teams there were, resulting in an 8-team D1 including the aforementioned brave teams like PL and Omega as well as N, without having to move up the reluctant yet high-seeded D2 teams. But that excess activity had evaporated by the time of the Season 13 rollout. And without the surplus of skilled teams that reinforced the D2 status quo, and an abject lack of perceived viable alternatives, Council finally decided they were done letting us serial duckers get away with it and forced Triton and MI up to D1. Season 13 is a conceptual junction in the sense that it pertains in some way to every single flaw I observed with CTL. Whether each individual issue has its roots dating back to last decade or they're outright OJ's fault, it's all exhibited right here in a conveniently intertwined way that will make the video topic easy to relate as I go along. Up until this point in D1, there had been a generally agreed upon truce between the side of Council that wanted to push high D2 teams up to D1 and the side that was content with the admittedly stagnant status quo, but with so many past D1 teams now out of the question, Council decided that D1 needed a newly inducted floor of consistently participating teams to prevent its total collapse moving forwards. And so, cue one of the most severely autistic tickets in CTL's history, in which we epically grappled with the most pressing CT MKW philosophical issues known to man: the D1 distinction and D2 status quo, the future of CTL activity, the psychological nature of fearing other teams, and the relation of Council itself to self-serving team leaders. But after thousands of messages, paragraphs of heartfelt text, and countless failed attempts at brokering transfer deals, Zach, Pascal, and I were left stonewalled at each turn by Ryan, UK, and OJ. It was clear this was the one Zach wasn't getting out of. Whether or not I think the D1 and 2 self-perpetuating segregation was the best approach is, in terms of a full dissertation, beyond the scope of a video I promised wasn't going to be another doubleheader by virtue of laziness, but it will be relevant again when I arrive at the CTC part of the commentary. What struck us, as well as MI, as the most insulting aspect of our involuntary inclusion in D1 was just how patronizingly the entire ordeal was treated. The traditional vote for either 3 or 4 team playoffs was foregone so as to mandate 4 team playoffs, ostensibly to ameliorate the situation, which only felt more insulting given that the outcome for the 4th seed would have been being given the honor of spending your 3rd coveted weekend afternoon playing 6C on top of the previous 2 main season matches, with the cherry on top being an additional clause that dropping more than 1 main season match would result in instant disqualification. The D1 reps chat gave Council a substantial amount of shit for this, and the blame went to every place you'd expect it to. OJ, JC, since he was the one who announced the compulsory 4-team clause, and the rest of SV Council. But the more immediate personal concern for us was to see whether the D1 experience was just as hopeless as Zach had told us he believed it would be each time we'd called him out for being scared in the past. Just as we were reconsidering our place in the league, it seemed that Jack from MI was doing much of the same, because his reactionary pushback came in the form of a veiled threat that CTL wouldn't be seeing the likes of MI for much longer if they continued to make uncompetitive decisions, and he knew that Zach would likely agree. The idea of an invitational D2 league had previously been semi-ironically thrown around, so it'd be disingenuous to claim that the outset of Season 13 was the moment when the seed of an idea for a new league was planted. Rather, this is the moment at which the seed sprouted. Contempt for Council's decisions were sourced from all throughout D1, and it became apparent that the D2 expatriates were not only not alone in their grievances, but that they'd become entwined with D1's. staple teams from both of the most important divisions weren't just dealing with the byproduct of Council's overzealousness by virtue of playing unbalanced main season matches against each other, but the structure of the league itself was now being interfered with even further. Yet again, I'll specify to keep Council's attitude here in mind, because this harm reduction approach to playoffs is one of many concepts I've noticed that is continuing to re-emerge even in CTC. Regardless, the Season 13 playoffs would eventually roll around after a disarmingly unremarkable season, which likely caught Council off guard for what happened next. Frozen was yet again temp banned from GSC around the time of playoffs for some superfluous E-dating drama I don't care to get into, but 6E was still fully intent on using him for the finals versus Low Tape. And it was the temp ban debacle of just one player that catalyzed the complete decimation of D1 finals in what amounted to an act of pure disregard for the authority supposedly held by all of the CTL staff, and a turning point for the league's already tenuous sense of inherent authority. Since CTL had demerged with GSC, which I once again stated my thoughts on in episode 5, OJ and the rest of Council were technically operating with a very high degree of autonomy. The MK Central merge was known to the staff teams of GSC and CTL staff, but it wasn't yet in effect, the strict meaning of which was that no one on CTL staff had to answer for their decisions. However, behind the scenes, the implications of this were admittedly murkier. If OJ had been receptive to letting Frozen play despite his GSC ban, the decision would have had remarkably bad optics for a league that was about to be adjacent to all the rest of MKW's community structures that were smoothly ushering in the MKC era. Even without taking any pre-existing circumstances into consideration, this would have already been a very difficult to navigate situation for OJ and the rest of the staff. There's no position more unenviable as an administrator of any organization than when upholding your code of conduct and keeping everyone content are mutually exclusive approaches. And while I'll explain why I ultimately can't be entirely sympathetic to the backlash against CTL Council, the subject of the community's perpetually disapproving treatment of staff members was one of my earliest observations long before I ever wanted to convey anything I'd thought about, because each iteration of MKW league development I've borne witness to has demonstrated the same breach in wider community agreeableness, and I feel as if it's intuitively understood but rarely expressed, at least considerately. It should be self-evident that I don't have very much more insight to offer than any indiscriminately chosen member of the community does, made painfully apparent to me when I saw Clay, Brody, and Letta get 90% scores on every CTL trivia quiz and realized that I've forgotten more than I can presently remember about the game, but the abuse of MKW community staff is something I've taken more particular note of on top of being around for quite a while. I think the first time I felt bad for someone in this way was actually Fruits, who did the super majority of the organizational work for more than a few lounge tourneys while giving himself ELO the whole time, but he had even previously tried hosting them entirely on his own. It's hard to convey the level of bitching I was privy to in one of his tourneys when people were upset about however it was that he was or wasn't doing some given thing, and from what I could tell he actually became quite upset over it, understandably so, and he didn't host any more of his own tourneys after that. I don't even believe that Fruits ran the tourneys poorly at all in retrospect, especially given how long lounge staff have taken to do a task as straightforward as generating the rooms for each successive round for years now. It seemed to me at the time that the reason nobody else stepped up to independently host tourneys is because they tacitly realized that they'd be harassed all the same with no tangible benefit. It wasn't until years later when ELP, a COVID-era joinator without first-hand experience, decided to try the same thing and was met with all the same apathy and hostility from a contemporary generation. No matter whether it's expressed in the form of blowback for a staff member being incompetent like Dragonfly99 or too competent and overbearing like Sartaglo, it seems that everyone in a position of MKW community authority simply becomes exhausted from consistently dealing with a toxic community. I've seen the optimistic reformer type beaten down time and again ever since the community's shift towards a kind of postmodern skepticism in the post-MKPS era. I would contrast OJ with one of these specific archetypes, but he appears to me to embody a wide multitude of them all at once. Here's someone who's been accused of everything from negligence to micromanagement, from individual persecution to nepotism, and it's all reflected in his impositional methodology. Council did implement community-centric measures, but OJ notoriously didn't give much concern for the community's desires when he believed he was in the right, and it led to constant clashes with the player base. What differentiates him as the face of a league from previous community members that have put their necks on the line is that OJ isn't a hate sponge, he's Newtonian, and his equal and opposite reaction to ungratefulness was on continual display from the moment of CTL's GSC demerge. In other words, I don't think the fact that OJ had a harsher administrative philosophy once things got down to brass tacks changes how much of it was induced by the community's toxicity. Perhaps the hardest mental hurdle to overcome as a staff member in a toxic community is that just because the community's dislike for you is personal doesn't mean it's not a ubiquitous phenomenon. Hopefully someone just took a shot somewhere hearing me say the U word. In any case, although I'm understanding of how any aspiring community leader could find themselves hemmed in by converging pressures, I still would have handled the aforementioned Season 13 final situation differently. Even if it was somehow the case that implied coercion from MKC staff was the reason why Council didn't want to let Frozen play finals, I feel that it still would have been a shrewd decision because it would have served as an opportune olive branch and proved to the skeptical top D1 teams that the sovereignty now held by an autonomous post-demerge CTL staff team was being used to give the player base a preferable experience to a centralized league. If anything, the impending centralization that was to come should have inspired the kind of decision-making that couldn't exist within a unified overprofessional structure. As for the far-fetched hypothetical where MKC somehow steps in to try to demote him, I just find it exceedingly unlikely. This isn't like some TV show where someone working for the government will get fired and replaced. Not to mention he wasn't under their authority yet anyways. The world where MKC's future authority was simply not appealed to would have incurred no consequences, but because Frozen was not allowed to play officially within the league, here's where I get back to the narrative tangent I never finished. 6C and Low Tape proudly organized and streamed an external best-of-3 scrim with Frozen in it, with the loser of the unofficial official set agreeing to forfeit the CTL finals, and after a 6C sweep, that's just what Low Tape did. Given the external player sub fiasco of the 7C MI finals from Season 14's D2, it seems as if the punished D1 finalists of the preceding season may have been onto something, but I digress. The outset of Season 14, just off the back of a joint defiance at the most prominent level, would set the stage for the complete collapse of the D1 to come. Not even the time-tested early season motivation cycle seemed encouraging enough to keep a 5-team div active on the eve of MK World's release. A few days prior to the transfer deadline for Season 14, Council's ultimate verdict on the Season 13 final situation would be handed down. It was the result of collective hours of SV's work in meeting out something that would ensure the div had a chance of operating on schedule while still suitably punishing the players responsible for the match-fixing debacle. But 6C remained steadfast in their stubbornness and refused to give Council the time of day, so much so that Brody and Zilla signed up to bench the new low-tape successor team OK and wiped their hands clean of the penalty that 6C would have received had they signed up again. D1 then proceeded to go for 2 months without playing a single match from May to July, almost entirely because of MK World's release in early June, but absolutely not helped by the league's flailing organization. In contrast to the evident effort put into the 6C low-tape clause, Council's attempts at stepping into the main season inactivity were equally as half-hearted as the remaining D1 teams were in the wake of the MK World Extinction event. Just 3 weeks worth of the total scheduled main season matches had been played by the time the division went totally dark, and by the time the forcibly scheduled 2GP best-of-1 finals were over, the second joke D1 in a row quietly and unceremoniously came to an end. You begin to wonder if the refugees who didn't look back after migrating to World are even aware that any of this happened. Last season's D2, on the other hand, which saw both of the aforementioned teams that had struggled so hard against their D1 intervention, was determined not to go out the same way. Council was in no mood to force a format as they had just done so with Draft, so all tracks predictably won the collective vote. But All Tracks is just that, an open book and a mirror through which the player base's track taste can be reflected, theoretically with almost total freedom. So Letta and Akira from VG came up with an ingeniously simple idea. Enter the People's Bolshevik tracklist revolution of D2. VG wanted to recreate the weekly tracklist format, which hadn't been in place for almost 2 years since Season 9 in late 2023, by getting each team to agree by an honor system that would bind them to a list made outside the scope of Council's approval. Leto went as far as to personally recreate the 1 to 10 runnability ranking system that underscored the weekly tracklist algorithm when the format was played previously, which I actually commented on with my own improvements, although I don't think anybody else read them. The proceedings were even more promising than expected, with every team in the division agreeing to abide by the honor system, understandably raising the question, what if Council were to officialize the lists? After all, every team had agreed, and it would serve as a preemptive measure to avert pen-related disputes from teams who may have otherwise been incentivized to forego the honor system for the sake of winning a close match. Cue yet another melodramatic series of events brought on by Kit, who was fucking playing for us, deciding all on his own to make a scene about having signed up to play all tracks, the resulting controversy in D2 Reps chat, subsequently inspiring the wonderful outro quote for this episode. Once again, I can't say I envy OJ and the rest of staff having to watch as the div threatened to implode, especially with an administrative challenge that was as unprecedented as this, which may not be immediately apparent. With talk in the air of deposing council and a perceived loss of their authority as a result of the lack of trust placed in said authority, even the act of giving the D2 reps what they almost universally wanted would have no longer been an olive branch but rather an act of placation. To Council's credit, though, they did agree to codify the tracklist format into the D2 rule set and coordinated the lists themselves, giving us the official return of weekly tracklists. Even I, as an all-tracks elitist, appreciated the chance at a break from the track pick monotony of previous seasons, and I can say now it went great. Funnily enough, the only other major D2 controversy of the season took place in playoffs under all tracks. There really must have been something special about the tracklists. Upon further reflection, I'm incredibly grateful that Letta put so much effort into turning VG's idea into a reality, because the account of the Season 14 tracklist attests to the crucial importance of someone willing to champion a cause and be the forerunner that translates potential into reality. I think if you had asked each of the team leaders of the D2 teams individually whether they'd be okay with the idea of playing a tracklist season, they still would have agreed, but in such a way that doesn't yield any tangible results. If not for a centralizing figure to step up and force the meme by putting in hours of foundational work, everybody will default to being non-committal and inadvertently bring about the kind of feet-dragging that results in nothing being done despite all the lofty aspirations that were begun with. Although the unlikely revival of tracklist was great news for D2, quite the opposite was the case for Council, because the success of the independent actions of the D2 reps proved that CTL's administration no longer had the final say. And so, seeing the dichotomy of the lack of effort to counteract the loss of motivation brought about by MK World in D1 and the great success of D2 acting unilaterally as their own sub-league, behind the scenes Jack and co were working to do the same thing they would have done anyways, making their own league. In a unique circumstance like the inception of a whole new league, there exists the opportunity to push reforms through the door without the kind of pesky interference that comes with intrinsic consideration for the otherwise more entrenched old rule set. Doing something like what CTC has done with the Season 1 rule set changes is also the kind of alteration to the in-game experience that fosters a sense that you are playing something novel and different. The changes in question being mandatory BRSTMs only, as well as, thank God, finally the removal of draggable blue shells. I've spoken to Jack about this personally, and he told me that he's always been willing to make the change in Lounge, but had been told that it would only be agreed upon if they were removed from the CTL rule set as well for the sake of consistency. Unlike with the Meathead era nostalgia I still get, while knowing full well it's completely uncompetitive, I guarantee nobody will ever look back fondly on blue back bombs. The fact CTL never pulled the trigger on removing them seems to be further evidence of a lack of ability to read the room insofar as the CT community's tilt towards competitive integrity as of recent. I forget if I've specified this before, but it still bears repeating if I have. I've historically been unimpressed with the MKW community's ability to do away with old organizational structures that aren't serving people well and replacing them with superior ones. MKPS wasting the vastly increased activity of COVID with its esoteric itinerary that locked low div teams out of playing for months, the complete failure of Ladder V2 despite its admittedly valiant effort to loosen the reins on chat moderation insanity, so on and so forth. And unlike with the bizarre byproducts of MKPS-era experimentation like First to 7 and Troll No Star, I found the aforementioned CTC changes to not just be much more measured, but also perfectly developmentally timed, with regards to CTL's administrative deterioration, of course, but also as a reaction to MK World and the remaining player base's efforts to create something new that will retain the activity that is left without apathetically letting it diminish further. Or at least that's what I would be saying if not for one of the most seemingly indefensible seeding predicaments ever. In addition to the rule set changes, upon the launch of the CTC server, it was announced that there would not be a track format poll for this season and that we'd all be playing divisional draft by executive order. As I mentioned briefly at the end of last video, I thought this was an incredible development. Divisional draft is something I've been passionate about since its conception and is a topic I've covered in the past in episode 6, which feels great to be able to say. Seeing teams use the then hypothetical strategies I outlined for maximizing the individual team benefit potential of the div draft was equally as vindicating, although I know nobody watched the episode and just reasoned through the thought process themselves, but still. It's the tempered selection of just 72 total tracks per division that is part of why I was so interested in experiencing the format, which is why I was so confused when I seemed to be the only one concerned about how many tracks would be in the pool following the announcement of a 10-team D1. My efforts earlier in the video to outline CTL Council's challenges in distinguishing between D1 and 2 are a useful primer to the multifaceted circumstances that predicated the CTC staff's decision, and to that end their rationalization doesn't deserve to be immediately flippantly written off as many people did on the day of prelim seedings releasing. There isn't enough interest to seed a satisfying bifurcation, and it's a message on behalf of the staff that their aim is to promote competition for its own sake so as to preemptively repudiate the notion that teams can or should try to get away with the kind of behavior that Jack and Zach, who are now admins of the league, were most known for themselves, which makes the intended message more personally meaningful. I was initially going to meander for a while longer as to what extent I can recognize the perceived upsides of D1-2, but the purpose of such a section would have been to try to accommodate a viewpoint that I simply don't agree with. If you aren't already of the mindset that this season's seedings are defensible after my very brief stint of devil's advocacy here, then I imagine you'd be a hard sell to say the least. My true opinion is that every division must absolutely be clearly differentiated, whether a 4-team D1 and 6-team D2, 5-team division for each, or some other unforeseen alternative would have been the outcome. It would have been, in my mind, preferable to what we were given. The sticking point doesn't have as much to do with the range of skill across the mega division on a tangible in-game level as it does with it on a conceptual level. Lounge has always been a melting pot in a way that CTL was unmistakably not. Otherwise, inactive players viewed the league as an ultimatum, something to weigh on for, and it's this factor that is responsible for a standard of league activity that could not be accurately mapped if it were to be guessed at with lounge activity as the only point of reference. But now, following recent developments, both CT Lounge's one-room ultra skill-gapped queues and CTC's highest echelon of competition now both function as melting pots of players that incorporate a very wide range of skill. Whereas CT Lounge now prominently features Grandmasters playing versus Irons, the deliberate competitive experience that is CTC only has teams of Grandmasters paired up against Silvers. Wonderful. Far more concerning to me than the subject-to-change skill gap in a not particularly active sub-community, though, is what the act of implementing such a band-aid solution to the decrease in activity represents. I feel as if although the number of people willing to even so much as wee on once a week to play has dropped so dramatically, staff have retained an outdated mental image of what activity should look like based on what it was prior to World's release, which in this case paints a picture of desperation to try to maintain the previous div composition. In reality, the paradigm shift that has occurred requires a complete mental overhaul. I can imagine CTWL staff, who were used to working with even fewer teams under more stringent limitations, eagerly seeding the 24 teams that signed up this season without ever feeling as if they'd need to resort to such unorthodox tiering because they were used to fewer teams playing overall. Despite everything though, after poring over D1-2 conceptually, I've actually done a mental loop back around. I realized that the div is likely going to be a far less futile endeavor than it seems when you're staring at a comical-looking seedings graphic of 10 teams in a single division, and that's really the mentality that the inaugural CTC Council was likely operating under when deciding upon it. Even with a more optimistic perspective though, there's cause for concern. Only having to play 6C once will soften the understandably demotivational blow, but the lengths that were gone to in order to preemptively counteract potential demotivation are a bridge too far in my opinion. The playoff qualification criteria make the justification for Season 13's D1 look like a thesis on metaphysics, with the top 8 out of 10 teams qualifying for their own individual 4-team playoffs brackets. The reason this is such a focal point of my bitching is because it's a shameless appeasement clause crafted to appeal to the same sentiment that caused so much strife throughout the back half of CTL, a playoff-centric culture. It should go without saying that as someone on a team historically at the epicenter of this phenomenon, I've seen firsthand the same idea that propagated across our team mirrored in the rest of High Div. That is, reinterpreting the main season exclusively as a gamified point-collecting marathon before the real thing begins in playoff semis. It's one thing to claim this 8-team playoff contingency promotes inting so as to reach the lower D2 bracket, but loopholes like that should never be claimed to be the fault of the organizers because trying in a league environment should always be implied. Thanks to Zach UK and Pix's old podcast episode for that insight, but rather it reestablishes the overwhelming sense of importance that has been mentally placed on playoffs so as to devalue what should be the inherent enjoyability of competing during the main season. With that being said, though, from a dialectic perspective, the counterpoint to this, that being throw D2 players in a div with 6C and MI where half of them will never feel like they had a chance at qualifying for playoffs, is still the worst alternative. And in practicality, the more you become accustomed to this new div, the less outlandish it continues to seem, even if it's only by virtue of the mere exposure effect. Maybe it is just fine after all. In any case, no matter how competitive or uncompetitive this experiment ends up being, my hope is that there will be a silver lining to this division structure. I think the decentralized nature of the div can reintroduce players who have been stuck in that playoff-centric, results-oriented culture to the perspective that people did have all those years ago in CTWL, that of playing to play, and competition being its own reward. It's that kind of intrinsic self-motivation that will keep us coming back to carry the torch even after it inevitably dawns on us that we're all playing endlessly for no real reason. And on that positive note, thank you for watching.